Yeah, I was educated as a physicist and went to MIT undergraduate, Princeton for grad school, and what really got, can you hear me in the back? Am I loud enough all the way back in the back? Is that good? Okay. And what drew me into physics was really curiosity. I wanted to know how the universe worked. I felt, I felt intuitively there was a connection between things that are nearby, and things that are far away. If you look out into the starry night, some summer night when the stars are clear, if you spin around, you feel this force when your arms are lifted up from your side. It's, of course, that's centrifugal force, but you'll also notice the stars appear to be spinning in your reference frame, and that was one of those little observations that made me wonder, is there some connection between things that are far away and things that are nearby? And when I was in freshman physics class, I had enough math to be dangerous, and I tried to do some calculations that suggested maybe there was a way that you could show that connection. I talked to my physics professor, and he said, "Oh, well, you've heard of Mach's principle, haven't you?" And of course, I had not. But Ernst Mach, the man who, after whom the Mach number and high-speed jet flight is named, felt that there was some connection between the distant matter and things nearby, and that it might be possible to actually figure out what our physical forces are, electromagnetism, gravity, etc., if we understood that connection. So I liked that idea because it had that deep, far-reaching philosophy that actually has a chance to explain some things and maybe make things simpler. When I went through my education, I found that that's not incorporated into present-day physics. Einstein liked the idea too and thought he was going to be able to do it. His theory of gravity, called general relativity, he intended to include that idea, but when he got finished with the theory, Mach's principle fell away. So that was one of those ideas that has been in the back of my mind for a long time. I didn't have any encouragement by mainstream physics that it was anything more than just kind of a crazy hope. Until the mid-'80s, I began hearing rumors about something called remote viewing. And it was my first clue that maybe the universe does act this way. There is a way to connect things that are far away with things that are nearby. There's a force that's not in our present Western physics, the way it's written down, that actually does explain this connection. So that kind of got me looking at things like consciousness, like what we call paranormal phenomena, the things that Western physics pretty much ignores. But if we really understood how those things work, maybe we would be able to include these long-distance connections into our physics and have a new physics, an expanded physics, which includes the effect of consciousness. Of course, Bob Monroe was one of those pioneers who had the scientific mind, but also was not afraid to look at these strange phenomena. Some of his experiences, when he would go into out of body and he would see a hole in the wall and go into it and find another dimension, another world through that wall, suggested that maybe higher dimensions or parallel realities are something real. I mean, there was a quality of his experiences where they would often find the same world when he would go through that hole, not every time, but often enough to give you the idea maybe these parallel realities aren't just imagination, maybe there's some aspect of reality about them. So we'll talk today more about higher dimensions and parallel realities because those are things that you can actually understand from a physics point of view, and maybe we'll be able to better understand how to connect consciousness with science. Of course, when you go to higher focus levels, each focus level has its own quality, its own sense of a dimension, of certain rules and certain aspects that seem to be constant for that focus level, and also kind of reminds us of parallel dimensions and higher dimensions. A lot of research, as you know, has been done by many people, Scott Rogo, Keith Harari, Hubbard, and Puthoff, that suggest that the out-of-body experience does have a quality of reality about it, that you can actually measure physical effects that tell us that it's more than just our imagination. We're not just in our mind, but that our mind actually goes somewhere in some cases. So our analysis of these effects has led us to a similar conclusion, that these parallel realities may actually have some actual existence. As you know, in Western physics, consciousness very early in the 20th century was important. In the days when quantum mechanics was first being researched, there were these terrific debates between Einstein and Bohr, Niels Bohr, about quantum physics, because they noticed that if an observer makes a measurement, something called a wave function collapse occurs. If you leave the experiment alone, quantum physics works its own magic, and the equations describe what they call a wave function, which tells you how things are supposed to unfold and behave. But if you make a measurement, it messes up that wave function. It actually kind of forgets what it's doing. It collapses into a quantum state, and you start all over again in a way. So you create noise when you make a measurement, and you lose some of the continuity that was present before. So consciousness affects quantum physics, and they understood that very early. This is what bothered Einstein a great deal. He made the comment that God doesn't play dice with the universe, because it leads to an uncertainty that Einstein felt intuitively, there's something missing here from this picture. But at least they were both looking at consciousness. They were facing that it was important. Now, if you were a physicist and you're listening to this debate 100 years ago, you'd say, man, consciousness is really important if I want to ever understand quantum physics, which is the foundation of Western physics. So you'd think for the last 100 years, Western physics would put a lot of emphasis into studying consciousness. How does it fit with Western physics? How does it behave? But instead, by and large, after you take your quantum physics course in college, and they tell you this story about the interaction and the wave function collapse, that's the last you hear about it. And you can't publish, by and large, studies on consciousness in mainstream physics journals. They pretty much go along as if consciousness is not important. So mainstream Western physics does not know a lot about consciousness beyond this elementary fact of wave function collapse. So we're coming up to a time now where we have a lot of experiments that have been done by other groups that are showing that consciousness can be very powerful. And so it's time to go back and revisit this and find a way to put the two together. But Western physicists are not probably the ones who are going to do it, because they haven't been worrying about this problem for most of the time. One example of the effect of consciousness, which Einstein raised, which he kind of felt would be the coup de grace to this whole idea of wave function collapse, because he thought that it was so ridiculous, was the Schrödinger cat paradox. And the thought experiment is that you have a cat in a box that you can't look into. It's sealed. Inside there's a Geiger counter, and there's a radioactive process, something that's emitting alpha particles, let's say, at a random quantum physical way. If the detector detects an alpha particle, it drops poison into the water, and it fills the room, the little box, with a gas that kills the cat. But if the whole thing is sealed, the observer doesn't know whether this has happened or not. So from a quantum physics point of view, according to the strict interpretation of quantum mechanics, there's an amplitude that it hasn't happened and an amplitude that it has happened. So inside the box, you'd have to picture a dead cat and a live cat, and both have some probability of being there, and therefore in the quantum physics point of view, their wave functions are both completely present there. And it's only when you open the box up or lift the flap that you find out and the wave function collapses into one or the other. Now Einstein felt this is a ridiculous situation and therefore tells us that there's something wrong with quantum mechanics. However, this is the current accepted view, and physicists just kind of learn to believe this and not be bothered by it. But it's an example of how powerful consciousness is in physical processes. I think we're at a time now where it's probably necessary to go back and look at these things again in terms of how can we fit consciousness into physics in a more consistent way. There are some things that are going on that are being measured and observed which are challenging to Western physics and actually break the laws of Western physics. And if you're a physicist, that's exciting because that means there's a chance to do something new. Of course, the reaction of most Western physicists has been to just ignore these experiments and not be bothered by them. That's another way to resolve the issue. Just close your eyes. When the remote viewing program, the military program, became public, as you know, many of the participants formed schools and made it possible for average folks like me to take remote viewing courses. I took several courses from Courtney Brown, who was trained by Ed Dames. And so then in the mid-90s, I took several courses. And even though I'm not a very good remote viewer, I had enough success and enough experiences to realize that, hey, this works. And of course, part of the method, and I'm telling some of you who know a lot more about this than I do, so please forgive me, but the methodology, as I understand it, is that there's a protocol that keeps your left brain, your analytical brain, busy categorizing things, filling in tables, and my left brain, it's very hard to shut up. It's very hard to keep it out of the problem. So this system worked well for me. And after a little while going through the protocol, I found myself in one particular example with a Spanish-style house with a tile roof, and I came up with Exodus and the Red Sea and a flurry of activity. And the drawing here, I've added color to it since the session, but that's what I was drawing. I was drawing Roman soldiers building a barricade, and in the distance there was something bright and dangerous with smoke and fire. And eventually I came up with destruction of Pompeii, which was the correct target. What I noticed in remote viewing is that regardless of whether you're right or wrong or even know where you are, there's a sense of being there. There's a sense of presence. You may not be able to figure out what it is, but there's still a sense that part of you is there. And that's remarkable given that many times the events happened a long time ago. Pompeii, a couple thousand years. One of our targets was the destruction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. And yet in the session, you're still right there. So that tells you that whatever this force is that's communicating between you and the target, that's not electromagnetism. That's not gravity. That's not any of the forces that's in our Western physics today. There's something else there. Jessica Utz was one of the people involved in evaluating that program when it ended, and she said, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it's concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. Of course, the Princeton Pear Lab was one of a number of labs that went about doing systematic studies after this information, and sort of parallel to it, they found using not the highly talented remote viewers in the military program, but just more or less average students and volunteers, but they still found with many, many experiments that they could come up with results, and they found that the accuracy for remote viewing does not weaken with distance, and you can have a time offset between the target and when you're doing your session. The time offset doesn't seem to affect accuracy either plus or minus, future or past. And this is true of other psychic processes as well, psychokinesis, ESP, etc., which means that these processes are totally unlike any of the forces that we know about in Western physics. This is a typical example from the Princeton Paralab. If you have one person or lots and lots of people, and they're more or less average, so they're not very good. They make a lot of mistakes, like I would, and so the answers look like a Gaussian curve, centered around the peak at 50%. You're half right and half wrong, except that the Princeton Paralab found a hump on the upper side. They still get more right than wrong, even for more or less average people. And when you have enough experiments, you calculate the odds of that hump being there, and at one point, after about 20 years of work, the odds were 55 billion to 1 for that hump being the size it was. In other words, overwhelming that it's real. ESP is real, psychic processes are real. At the present time, when they put together all their data, they're seeing like trillions to 1, odds against chance. So these are firmly established processes today, even though you won't hear the media talking that way, but these are real effects. Robert John, who ran that program, used to be head of the engineering department when I was there, concluded all forces known to physics, like gravity, for example, diminish with distance, and no force in physics operates freely across time like this. It's as if consciousness is somehow able to direct its influence directly across space and time, an understanding that certainly poses a challenge for science. And as you know, other people like Edgar Mitchell did a little surprise ESP experiment on his way back from the moon. He has the record, as far as I know, with long-distance ESP, successfully sending messages to people a couple 100,000 miles away. Measurements have been made of average people using, just looking at the brain waves. For most of us, we're not very disciplined. We don't meditate. If we're not under hypnosis, our brain is just very noisy. It's always chattering. We don't listen very well to what it's telling us. So for people like that, like me, and like a lot of people, you can still look at the brain waves. And this is an experiment done by Lloyd in the mid-70s, looking at the brainwave changes when an ESP message is received. And the top trace shows how the brainwave changes when you hear a musical note. The bottom trace shows how the brainwaves change when you receive an ESP message. Now these people, by and large, were asked after the experiment, did you receive an ESP message? And they said no. But their brain showed that they had received it, which tells us that virtually everyone has the basic receiving machinery to be able to receive psychic messages. Most of us haven't learned to quiet our minds to be able to listen. And of course, that's one of the great benefits of HemiSync and the technology here at Monroe, to learn to quiet your mind. But ESP is widespread. And the Baxter effect is one other example. I want to go very briefly through some of these because, I mean, for me, as a scientist, I want to understand how this stuff works as best I can. It may be that we'll be able to find better ways of achieving some of these states from understanding the science of it, but mostly it's all I know. This is what I'm interested in, is what consciousness can tell us about higher dimensions and about the deeper nature of reality. Cleve Baxter discovered that plants respond psychically to emotions and to feelings. He was working in his office late one night. He ran a successful polygraph training facility in New York at the time. He thought his house plant needed some water. Since it was late at night, he did one of those strange things people do when they're tired. He said, I wonder what would happen if I hooked up my plant to my polygraph machine. And he kind of figured, well, the conductivity will increase when I add water to it, so I would expect the trace would go down. But actually he found the trace went through waves and looked very much like a patient or a client having an emotional response to receiving water. That got his curiosity up. Polygraph operators are trained to put their client under stress. That's just their second nature. So the next thought that popped into his mind was, I wonder what would happen if I burned its leaf. Well, to his surprise, without doing anything and without saying anything, the trace went crazy on the polygraph right away. So the plant picked up his thought, and that got his attention. And that started along many years programs of doing research on the ability of plants to receive messages from people. Baxter kept a lot of plants wired up in his home after that, and here is a trace showing what happens when he broke an egg to put in his dog's food dish. When he broke the egg, basically he killed the fertilized cell in the egg. The plant responded with a big pulse right there on the trace. The plant was empathetic to the destruction of the egg. Baxter also found that if you pour living brine shrimp into boiling water, plants respond. Anyway, there's a lot more to it, as you probably know. It's fascinating research, but it shows even plants have this ability. As there's a program here, or has been certainly in the past, the PK, being able to affect the rolling of dice. The Princeton Pear Lab, among others, did a lot of work with how people can affect things at a distance with their minds. They used to have a vertical pinball machine. You drop a steel ball at the top, it hits nails and makes a path down to the bottom, and it kind of piles up in a Gaussian-shaped curve at the bottom randomly. Then they would ask someone to sit across the room and try to make the Gaussian curve move to the right. So the balls tend to fall to the right or to the left. And they found people could do that. But that machine was pretty cumbersome. So eventually they came up with what's called a random event generator, which is a little noise maker, electronic quantum noise maker that makes random ones and zeros. But it's equivalent. It's just like flipping a coin, but it's faster. And I used to have a friend who was part of this program, and they would ask her, she lived in Texas, they would say, okay, on Thursday from 10 until 11, we want you to try to make the generator go high. And so she would do that, and over time, sure enough, it tended to go in the direction that she wanted it to, and even though there was a couple thousand miles between her home and the Princeton lab where the generator was sitting. This is some data over time added together here. You can see that the red curve at the top shows what happens to the counts when people try to make it go high. The counts keep adding up, +1, +1, +1, and it goes higher and higher. If they're trying to go low to make a 0, then that makes the count lower and lower and lower. If you don't do anything, you get the line in the middle. So this is what happens with PK, and it shows that our minds are able to affect quantum noise, even over very large distances. And as I said before, the cumulative odds against chance for some of this data is now trillions to 1, which means these are real effects. Group consciousness occurs when many people begin thinking about the same thing at the same time. You might imagine that that would make a stronger effect. This was verified originally in some, I think there was an Academy Award experiment. It was one of them, and people were watching the Academy Awards, millions of people watching the same TV show. This data here is from the O.J. Simpson trial, when a lot of people were also tuning in to see what the verdict was. And they took 2 random event generators, both based on quantum noise. These should be totally independent of each other. One gives you a 1, the other should give an equal probability of a 0 or a 1. There should be no relationship. They were several miles apart. But they found that when many, many people focus on the same thought, these random event generators no longer act independent of each other. Now, when one gives a 1, the other tends to give a 1. One gives a 0, other one gives a 0, which means quantum noise over great distances becomes correlated in a way that totally flies in the face of Western physics. So when the TV pre-show begins, you get the first peak on the left. When the verdict was announced, you get the right peak. And it means these two objects are behaving very similarly, like they're coupled together when many people are watching the same thing. When 9/11 occurred, at that time there was a network worldwide of several dozen of these devices in many places around the world. All of a sudden you had a huge mass consciousness event when millions of people, or maybe even billions, were focusing on their TVs or listening on the radio and thinking about this event. And this global network of little REGs run by the Global Consciousness Project, Roger Nelson and Dean Radin, found that their little random event generators around the world began acting like they were coupled together. And you get these curves starting to rise far beyond whatever would be expected by chance. Here's a peak. At the time the airplanes hit the building, or shortly after that, about 60,000 to 1 odds against chance that that kind of correlation would occur. The same type of thing happens when there's other types of global synchronized events. This is for synchronized prayer, synchronized meditation. These networks also show correlations. They're showing that our consciousness is affecting space-time, it's affecting the laws of physics around the world. And it tells us that if we want to change the world, if we want to bring more peace to the world, maybe synchronized prayer is a way to do that, that we actually have power, more power than we realize, and we can measure the power of prayer by looking at how these numbers are affected when we pray together or meditate together. So these are more experiments showing our minds really are connected. The question is, how can we explain this in terms of Western science? We could think about the effect of consciousness. Another way that I'll talk about in a few minutes is called subtle energy, qi, which is a Chinese name for it, or the life force. You could think there's a force that actually arises when there are big consciousness events occurring. And a physicist might talk in a more less emotional way, called them non-standard vacuum states, but they're kind of all equivalent to each other. The vacuum is sort of like the basis of Western physics. It's where you start in trying to understand Western physics. It's the vacuum of outer space, but it's also the vacuum between atoms. It's the vacuum right in this room. It's sort of the nature of space when there's no particles there. And it's sort of like the beginning point of Western science. What the Russians found is that there's not just one vacuum state, that you can actually change it. It's not really empty, and you can change the energy in the state and therefore change how the vacuum behaves. And they took a DNA, shined a laser on it in a vacuum, and they found that it changed the vacuum. It created some kind of strange particle that had no mass, that could hang around for hours or sometimes even days when there was no matter in the vacuum chamber. This appears to be the first time that prana, or the life force, or qi, has been created in a scientific laboratory, and they did studies on it. But we have a lot more data to show that strange things happen, as I'm sure anyone who comes here frequently knows, and the out-of-body experience, of course, is one of them. That's also a challenge to Western physics. How do you explain this? These are states where there's probably no matter present, and yet there's intelligence. Things happen. A classic out-of-body experiment was done in the early 40s. It's called the Landau OBE case that was published in a journal. Mr. Landau's wife tended to go out of body when she was sleeping at night, and had all kinds of experiences. So they wanted to do a controlled test. So he said, okay, when you go out of body at night, I want you to take my address book, which you put beside your bed, and bring it in and leave it on my floor by me to show you've been there. And they were planning, I think, to leave the door closed just to make it even more exciting. But when she tried to pick up his address book, when she went out of body that night, her hand went through it. She couldn't pick it up because she'd been taught all her life, don't pick up things that aren't yours. As the best she could do, she looked around her room and found a little stuffed toy dog and picked that up and took that into her husband's bedroom. And so this little sketch is showing his perspective in his bed, looking out. She's just deposited the stuffed dog beside his bed, and she was kind of floating and gliding backwards, her astral body, her out-of-body form, semi-transparent and white-colored, backing out of the room, backing into her room. He could see her physical body still sleeping in her bed across the hall. So this was a typical example of an OBE case. Now, there are a lot of things in this example, as you might imagine, that Western physics doesn't have a clue how to explain, okay? First of all, I mean, Western physics doesn't know how you can have an intelligent form of matter or matter without mass or force without mass, or, you know, trying to describe the contradictions in terms of, for a Western physicist, you know, it's a big list of things that don't fit our Western science. This is another experiment Bob Monroe talked about, where he was in an isolated chamber that had wires in the walls, part of the electromagnetic shielding, but he hooked up a high voltage to the wire grid in the chamber and then tried to go out of body. And he found that although he normally was able to go out of through the walls, through the wires very easily, when high voltage was applied, he could not. The wires ensnared him. So there's a relationship between high voltage and the out-of-body state or the astral body, which suggests that there are experiments one can do, and there's some physics here. We may be able to learn more about how these things interact. Hubbard and Hal Puthoff and a couple other physicists learned that the Chinese were doing really interesting experiments with out-of-body. They had some remote viewers who were asked to try to look at a sealed envelope which had a Chinese character in the envelope and tell them what Chinese character was there. But the Chinese also had a piece of film in the envelope as well. So, and they found that when the viewer was successful at telling them the correct character, the film actually became exposed and was imprinted with the Chinese character. So there's some kind of energy that was present during the out-of-body experience, and the astral body, or whatever you want to call it, that was present at the location of the character caused the film to become exposed. So Puthoff and Hubbard tried to reproduce that in America using a photomultiplier tube, which is very sensitive, able to measure small amounts of light. And again, they found that the remote viewer, when he reported correctly on the nature of a picture or an image, that near that image there was a flash of light or presence of light that was anomalous. There was, again, a correlation, which says that our astral body, if you want to call it that, our center of consciousness that leaves the physical body, has some energy to it, has some ability to show up in our conventional physical measuring system. So there's something that's physical there, something that's, at least it's measurable, thank goodness, right? Another famous experiment by Carlos Osis, Alex Tannhaus was the remote viewer, the psychic involved in this experiment. He was strapped down to a chair in one lab, and then at the far end of the corridor in another lab was a sealed room with a chamber and a scene that mechanically was altered in a regular way, and they asked Tannhaus to describe what the image looked like. So we had to go out of body and go into the other room and be in a certain position to be able to see the scene and give the correct description. They found that when he did, the sensors that were set up around the chamber went crazy. They got very big readings. They had strain gauges, they had optical sensors, magnetic sensors, and so again it shows, there's a little picture of Tannhaus's astral body there, but something was present in the vicinity of the of the picture, so that when we see something, when we remote view something, in some cases there's some energetic form that's actually present where that occurs. Another type of experiment done by Keith Harary. He had a cat that was very fond of him, and vice versa, I guess. And they took the cat off into put him in a box out in the middle of a field. Harary was in a lab room some distance away, and tried to go out of body. And the cat was off, surrounded by a couple of strange experimenters in this little box. The floor of the box was ruled with squares, and they kept track of how many squares the kitten crossed and how many times he meowed per minute while the experiment was going on. And the bottom graph is, let's see, the number of meows. And the left-hand bar, the big bar that you can see, is the number of meows that the kitten made when, in the normal conditions. When Harary went out of body and tried to go to the kitten to comfort it, the right-hand bar, which you could just barely see, just almost zero, occurred. The kitten got very quiet when Harary was out of body trying to comfort the kitten. So the kitten knew that he was present. Other forms that are also a challenge to Western physics that are all related to this, orbs. Of course, there are plenty of examples of false orbs. It's easy to get orbs from your flash illuminating little raindrops or dust particles or insects, lens flares, things like that. But there are also pictures that appear to be genuine orbs. This is one that a friend of mine took. We were doing an experiment trying to photograph orbs, and after several days, the adults came up with zip, and a 12-year-old was walking back to the cabin and saw this 3-foot diameter orb hovering in front of the cabin and said, "I thought it wanted me to take its picture." So she did, and then it was zipped away. And this is another one, a friend of mine, we were doing some ghost hunting, and this strange-looking vortex showed up in the picture, which is probably, again, an orb. So there are some that show up that seem pretty likely to be genuine. This is one that showed up in the basement of a ghost hunter's house. He kind of grew up in this house that was very haunted, and we were revisiting his boyhood bedroom, basically, the lower floor of the house. All the lights were off. We had a Sony night shot camera going, and he was seeing many orbs in his viewfinder, and he was telling me about all of the orbs he was seeing. Well, either he had a better camera or he's just a lot faster, which is more likely, and I wasn't seeing anything. I'm standing in the dark with my camera and I'm not seeing anything, and I started to complain a little bit. I said, "Could you make him slow down? Could you ask one to appear for me?" So he speaks into the darkness and says, "Would an orb please show up for Claude's camera?" And within a couple of seconds, this one little dot, which is circled in this picture on the top frame, popped in, and over the next couple of seconds, very leisurely, it moved toward me and to the right. I got about 20 frames on my camera of this thing. So I'm convinced that it was a conscious response, and it was very easy to see that one. It was unmistakable. So, and of course, orbs are also often seen at time of death. I used to know a lady who worked at a hospital. She was a nurse and had been present with a number of patients at time of death, and she had seen on 3 occasions orbs leaving the body at time of death. And this was a famous photograph of the same type of phenomenon. There are lots of things that seem to happen when consciousness is involved, which cannot be explained by the conventional Western physics model. Levitation is another one. Our present theory of gravity certainly doesn't have any place in it to explain things like this. But this is a story from Yogananda's wonderful book, Autobiography of a Yogi. He said, I saw a yogi remain in the air several feet above the ground last night in a group meeting. My friend Upendra Mohan Chowdhury spoke impressively. I gave him an enthusiastic smile. Perhaps I can guess his name. Was it Baduri Mahasaya of Upper Circular Road? He nodded, a little crestfallen, not to be the news bearer. There are many accounts of adepts of various kinds and yogis who are able to levitate, although it's difficult to get them to come into the lab, so we don't have much data on this. One of the famous cases was Brother Joseph of Cupertino, a monk who who lived several hundred years ago, and for his other fellow monks in the monastery, it was kind of a problem because they took turns in the dinner service, and sometimes he'd be carrying the trays, and he'd begin floating up to the ceiling, and they would have to reach over and pull him down. When they were doing Mass, he would get very excited during the music, and he would sometimes start floating up. He would float to the front, to the altar. The Pope at the time did an investigation when he died and interviewed hundreds of people and concluded, yes, that it was genuine. We don't have a lot of really verified examples. This is David Douglas Hume, who was investigated by Sir William Crookes, who was the president of the Royal Society at one time and investigated Hume for many years, and he was able to levitate, among other strange phenomena. Just one more example, teleportation. These are challenges for Western physics again, but the Chinese, back about 20, 30 years ago, began doing a sweep of their population of 1 billion plus people, looking for individuals who had paranormal abilities. And Paul Dong, a Chinese American, has written several good books about some of the people they came up with and some of the phenomena that occurred. One was named Zhang Baozheng, who was gifted with teleportation and other abilities. He was given an expensive sports car. He lived in Hong Kong and was given an expensive sports car. He used to zip around town and speed at high speed or through stoplights with this fancy car, and policemen would pull him over and write him a ticket, but they got back to the police station and they found the tickets had all disappeared. So they learned after a while, just leave him alone, don't bother. But we know about some of these things because at one time, VIP visitors coming through China would be given demonstrations of some of these things. So we've had a little bit of access, but I think this has become more rare in recent years. Uri Geller is also was involved in a controlled experiment in England where he managed to make part of a crystal disappear that was encapsulated. Near-death experiences, another area where paranormal things, very difficult to understand, occur. I'm sure you all know about these, and maybe you've even had some yourself or have friends who have. The interesting thing about near-death experiences is that they've been known about for a long time. This is a painting by Hieronymus Bosch, 500, 600 years ago. This is called the Empyrean Realm. He's showing a tunnel to a region of light on the other end. There's spirals inside the tunnel. There are angels and beings there. It's very much like the description of the tunnel that people describe when going through a near-death experience. When you're on the other side, again, it's like a higher dimension. The rules are different. Here's Daniel Brinkley's describing his near-death experience, where these beings of light, each having a different color, carry some aspect of his personality and show him visions of the future. typically when people are on the other side, they come back describing it as a place that you can go to, as a dimension, there are features like buildings and other structures, although consciousness has a lot more effect over there than here, but it's as though these are parallel dimensions or higher dimensions. Reincarnation is, of course, another area of research where we can get more information about the nature of the other side. What is life after death like? There are people who have built devices where they're able to more or less successfully communicate with the other side, and this is Christopher Moon, a researcher in Colorado. Gary Schwartz, professor at the University of Arizona, did experiments with mediums who claimed to be able to contact those on the other side. Of course, a lot of skeptics would say, well, they're doing cold readings, they're looking at voice inflections, they're figuring out from how you respond. But Schwartz did blind experiments where the medium could not see the people he was reading. He just gave a cold reading totally without being able to see the other person. And these are the accuracies for 5 of the mediums he was testing. And they came out, most of them above chance, and showed that it was not any kind of trickery. There's a real phenomenon here. Some individuals have been able to learn how to master these abilities and are able to work with researchers to further demonstrate these things cannot be explained by Western science. Yogananda is on the right here, and his teacher Sri Yukteswar on the left. One of those wonderful, rare accounts of what life is like as a yogi, what the training is like, and various experiences he had with some of the great adepts in India. The lower graph shows another yogi being studied by Elmer Green in the early 70s, who was able to cause big changes in 2 different points on his hand, causing an 11-degree change difference between those 2 points by concentration alone. Other famous yogis or adepts or masters who learned how to do these feats. Apollonius of Tyana, who was lived there around the same time as Jesus, and in many places was even more famous than Jesus because of his ability to perform miracles. This is a comment, it's more or less a lament by one of the early church fathers, who says, "How is it that the talismans of Apollonius have power in certain members of creation? For they prevent, as we see, the fury of the waves, and the violence of the winds, and the attacks of wild beasts. And whilst our Lord's miracles are preserved in tradition alone, those of Apollonius are most numerous and actually manifested in present facts, so as to lead astray all beholders." Apollonius was quite famous at the time, and was actually, a statue of him was worshipped by the Roman governor during that part of his life. In later years, his fortune went against him, and they tried to arrest him and pulled him into court. And on 2 different occasions, the first time they opened a scroll listing all of his offenses and crimes, except when they opened it, the words had all disappeared, and it was totally blank. The second court case, and these are actually recorded in the Roman records of the day. The second time, he disappeared in a flash of light and smoke and was never seen again. But it's a well-documented case of an adept who did take part in Roman society at that time. I think what I've been trying to do is understand the nature of some of these higher dimensions and these abilities, because they're things that ought to be part of science. I mean, at least hopefully, but not the science we have today. There's not a place right now in our present Western science that can account for these things. But there are clues. Yogananda's teacher says, all creation is governed by law. The principles that operate in the outer universe, discoverable by science, are called natural laws. But there are subtler laws that rule the hidden spiritual planes and the inner realm of consciousness. Those principles are knowable through the science of yoga. It's not the physicist, but the self-realized master who comprehends the true nature of matter. And I think that one of the things that we learn here at the Monroe Institute is the nature of some of these higher dimensions by going to various focus levels, by learning more and more about how things behave in these higher dimensions. It's broadening our experience. That's one of the reasons I came to Monroe several times at various programs. And I mean, to me, this is the future. This is a clue to how the world really works. One more clue is found in a book by Yogananda's teacher, Sri Yukteswar, who's kind of explaining these higher dimensions and how the world is put together. And this diagram was what the students used to summarize what Sri Yukteswar was saying. And in it, there are various levels. There is the astral level with 10 dimensions. There's a causal level. There's the Buddhic level. At the bottom, there's a little bag hanging down at the very bottom, which is the physical level. And it sort of says that the physical world is really a small fraction of all the higher dimensions that all are present in our universe. And if we want to understand, the true universe, it's important to understand these higher dimensions. If you look at the theosophical material of Blavatsky and others, which all goes back to yogis in India, they talk about the physical, the etheric level, the astral plane, the mental, the causal, and the Buddhic. Each of these has dimensions, and typically as you go up in level, there are more and more dimensions. So these are all clues that in our normal physical life, we're only aware of a small fraction of what's really out there. And of course, if you make an out-of-body a vehicle, as they say, that you can travel in to have an out-of-body experience, then you can actually visit some of these dimensions. And many of the adepts who write in this literature describe what it's like and what the nature of these higher dimensions really is. One of the things that struck me in reading Yogananda's book is he talks about these higher dimensions as being made up of lifetrons. If you're in the astral realm or the causal realm or the mental realm, you may see structures, you may see landscapes. But it's not landscapes of physical matter. And yet, when you're in that dimension, it has many properties that are similar to a physical landscape. The rules may be a little bit different. It may respond to consciousness in a different way, but you see structures. It's not just a big blur. And so this idea of lifetrons and of some form of matter, as you might call it, seems to be present in all the higher dimensions. So that's been one of the motivations for me, trying to understand what these lifetrons are like and what the rules are by which they would exist in different dimensions. Of course, the layers around the body, the energy layers of the body, also are really important in understanding higher dimensions. Typically, if you're a clairvoyant or energy healer and are able to see the energy fields, then you may describe various levels. Mitek Birkus is an energy healer who lives here in Virginia, who actually Maryland, but in the DC suburbs. I met Mitek more than a decade ago. It's 2 decades ago. He's from Poland, but a very gifted energy healer and clairvoyant, and he could see these layers and would describe what he was seeing to me. The astral body, for example, was one of these layers, tends to correspond to our emotional state. As he watches it, he'll say that the energy is fluctuating. It'll come in and come out. The different colors will change as the emotions of the person change. This is sort of describing one dimension or one plane of the many levels that are present due to consciousness. It's been described You can think about it very simply in terms of these layers as being like little paper dolls, where you have a bunch of folded paper that are all folded over. You cut out a form, you have many levels here, and there's a physical level, an etheric, an astral, a mental. They're all present at the same time. They're all present around the body, but they each have a presence in a different dimension. Here is a Curlian photograph. A lady standing on a platform with high voltage, high frequency, while a camera is doing a time-lapse photography. And there is an aura showing up around her. When she's trying to go out of body, they found, remarkably, that the brightness that's showing up in the camera image, which is the right-hand frame here, actually appears to her side. So these things have a form of reality. They're real. But our Western science doesn't understand it. One of the things that I've come up with, it's in my second book, is, I think, an explanation for what the nature of the aura really is. My first book was called The Synchronized Universe, which pulls together these various paranormal phenomena, what's the evidence for each one of them. And then the last chapter is, how can we fit those into a scientific model to begin to explain them? Richard Bartlett, who developed matrix energetics and is a well-known healer in this country, made the following comment about my book, about this book. He said, well, he said very flattering things, let's put it that way. I blush. but I didn't stop me from putting it in the book. The second book is called Life Force: A Scientific Basis, and tries to look at these phenomena in terms of how you would make a science of it. And one of the things that is different between all these phenomena and normal Western science is the presence of a special energy, which the Chinese call qi, the Hindus call prana. It's an energy that doesn't obey the laws of Western physics, but it does. It's integral to consciousness. Consciousness creates it, consciousness affects it, and it seems to be one of the keys to going from where our science is now to a science that can include the effects of consciousness. And Professor Rustum Roy, a full professor at Penn State, called my book a tour de force. Elmer Green, who founded ICEAM, the subtle energy group, said it's one for the ages. I highly recommend it. And it's a big book. It took me about 7 years to write, and has a lot of references, a lot of graphs, a lot of figures. But I really tried to my best to kind of bring these things into a science. Both books have been used as college textbooks, and the real key is understanding the nature of this energy, the life force. It's been around and known for a long time, but the difficulty in integrating it to Western science is that it often shows up in different forms or different ways, and it's frequently not recognized for what it is. So I use this cartoon of the 6 blind scientists and the elephant, where the elephant is subtle energy or the life force, but when you look at it in different ways, you see different things. You see a rope, you see a tree trunk, you see a wall, just as the 6 blind men did. However, the Chinese knew about it for thousands of years. It's the basis of Chinese medicine. This is Wang Di, the Yellow Emperor, who formalized the Chinese medicine several thousand years ago. A modern Qigong master who uses it for healing says it's the fundamental life force that permeates all things. Qi connects and animates everything in the universe. The Chinese have learned how to use this energy for healing, and they can heal a lot of things that we can't heal in the West with conventional medicine. But this energy has amazing abilities to improve health and to heal diseases. a Chinese Qigong master says of this energy, over the years, I've treated more than 5,000 cancer patients and have no doubt through personal observations that Qigong made a positive difference in every one of them. There are lots of experiments to show that this energy does affect health in a positive way. I'm going to go briefly through some of this. One of the things that you notice, though, when these Qigong masters are using this energy, they do a special breathing. They build up this energy in their body by pulling it in, using intention to build up a concentration of it. When they do that, then they're able to do their miracles, to have this effect. So the Hindus call this technique of breathing pranayama. You're building up the level of subtle energy within the body. Martial artists in China have used this for thousands of years as a form of warfare, a form of protection. In this particular example here, the fellow on the right is using qi to strengthen his body, to act like armor to protect it, while his buddies are attacking him with a pole, trying to knock him over. And it turns out that as you look into the literature, you find this energy has been known in almost every traditional or ancient civilization. The kahunas in Hawaii used this energy. Native Americans used it as well. They would charge up poles or pieces of wood with this energy and throw it at their enemy. And when it strikes the enemy, the qi or the prana goes into the enemy and makes him unable to control his muscles. They fall over, and there are many accounts of this, even American cavalry officers talking about this type of warfare going on with Native American tribes when they first encountered them. So projecting this energy at a distance, some people find that they can project the energy without using a pole to charge it up. This is Master Paul Dong on the left, using the qi directly. It can be projected through the air as a martial art form where there's no physical apparatus involved. He wrote a book called Empty Force, where he puts many accounts down of examples where this has been done. Another Qigong expert, Jixing Li, who is also from China but lives in California part-time, did experiments with this energy to show that you could project it long distance to affect cancer cells directly. In this experiment, Master Li was in California. A Western scientist was at Penn State in Hershey, Pennsylvania, with an incubator full of petri dishes with cancer cells growing in them. If you don't do anything to the cancer cells, the numbers of cells just rise exponentially over time. Then he would ask Master Li to send his energy to a particular dish, and he would notice the numbers of cells began curving over and going back to zero. He'd kill them from 2,000 miles away, and he could send the energy to a particular petri dish without affecting the other dishes around it. So this energy can be controlled by consciousness and can be directed very accurately. Another Qigong master, Dr. Yan Jin, used to do lectures. He would talk about projecting qi. And while he was talking about it, he would actually project it around the lecture hall. He was studied by physicists in China at the National Physics Institute there. They found that lithium fluoride crystals, which are used in particle physics detectors, they would set them up around the room, and when he projected qi, he would get counts, extra counts on these crystals. And this graph is showing on the horizontal blue line the background, the number of counts, the count rate you'd normally get, not doing anything. When he projected this qi around the room, they got 20 times more counts. So again, they're seeing this energy. It's actually, it can be measured. Dr. Yan Jin also was able to show that this energy can affect other physical processes that defy Western science to explain. Here, they had a Geiger counter set up with a radioactive decay target, americium, which gives off alpha particles randomly at a regular rate. It's decaying. When they asked the Qigong master to slow down the rate of decay, he could do it. They asked him to speed up the rate of decay. He could do that. He went 1,900 kilometers away. He could still change the rate of decay. So he could change effects that our science cannot begin to explain how you can do that, but the Qigong masters could do it. It's a form of PK, but here we have a better understanding of what the mechanism is that's making it possible. He was also able to change water structure and bend laser beams at great distances as well. One of the great scientists of the 20th century, he used to live in America, but it was a Chinese extraction, and then I apologize for my pronunciation here, Chen Shushen, who was kind of made big news when he went back to China a couple decades ago, but he was famous here. He founded the Chinese Aerospace and Rocket Program. He authored a book in America called Engineering Cybernetics. He was listed in Wikipedia as one of the founders of Jet Propulsion Lab at Caltech and named Person of the Year in 1988 by Aviation Week in Space Technology. So he was a top scientist in this country before he went to China and became a leader in their space program. He studied the experiments that were done by Dr. Yan Jin, which were done in collaboration with the National Physics Institute in China. And here's what he said. He said, these experimental results by Dr. Yan Jin and his co-workers are a first in the world. They unequivocally demonstrate that without touching substances, the human body can affect them and change their molecular structures and properties. They are new scientific discoveries and the prelude to a scientific revolution. So that's the energy of consciousness. It's unlike any other force, and it's prelude to a scientific revolution. Professor Joey Jones at the University of California, Irvine, did experiments with the same energy. He was doing healing experiments with it. He took a certain strain of human-derived cells called HeLa, or HeLa cells, that he exposed them to gamma radiation, a large dose, that killed half of them in 24 hours. Then he asked healers, okay, see if you can send this healing energy to my cells and see if you can make them live longer. And here's what he found. And this experiment he continued over and over again over a 10-year period, hundreds, thousands of repetitions, very good statistics. He found that if you don't do anything, 50% survive after 24 hours. He kind of set things up so this would be normalized as the result. 50% die, 50% survive. That's the left-hand bar graph. Then if you send the healing energy after the radiation, 70% survive after 24 hours. If you do the healing before the radiation, 80% survive after 24 hours. If you do healing both before and after the radiation, 88% survive. This is replicated over and over again over many years. But he was frustrated because that was as high as he could get. Now, if you're familiar with healing experiments, energetic healing experiments, that's a remarkably high success rate. It's a fantastic success. Professor Jones was troubled, though. He said that he thought it should be 100%. He said, why is it not 100%? And one day, the thought occurred to him, maybe it's the karma of the cells. So in his next experiment, he had his assistant make a telephone call to a charity and make a gift to the charity with the intention that the good karma from this act would go to the cells. And this survival rate went to 96%. And it was replicated 100 times after that. So it's our first demonstration of this spiritual result, that karma itself is actually real, and now we have a measurable effect from it. So be good for goodness sakes. So all these experiments are talking about the life force and its connection with consciousness, but the question is, what is it? What, in terms of science, how do we understand this stuff? How can we connect it to the things that we understand in science? Is there a way? And there, I think the biggest breakthrough has been what the Russians call torsion. It was discovered in the hard sciences and astrophysics in the 1950s by a scientist named Kozyrev. At the present time, fully developed equations and experiments and patents and devices have been built. Here are what some of the, what one of the people involved in that program said. And by the way, you can go back to the great book, Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain, by Ostrander and Schroeder, one of the great classics from 1970. These two ladies were over there in Eastern Europe and in Russia doing research at that time, talking to researchers about various phenomena, and the book is just packed with amazing insights and observations. They have a whole chapter on this man, Nikolai Kozyrev, and his work with torsion, because he felt that he had identified one of the real secrets of the nature of time, and was demonstrated things for them at that time. And the reason I'm saying that is because now, 40 years later, subsequent events have only borne out the importance of what he was doing. But here's one of the other people involved in the torsion program. He says from the late 80s until the late 90s, major experimental investigations were conducted that confirmed the theoretical predictions. It was established that torsion generators allow us not only to replicate all phenomena demonstrated by so-called psychics, but they're also able to demonstrate effects that were never demonstrated by any psychic. In other words, torsion appears to be the key force that makes psychic phenomena possible. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence to suggest that there was a secret program going on in Russia for several decades. And we only know about it because glasnost and perestroika, when the wall came down, the Berlin Wall came down, and Russia released its client states in the early 90s, and a lot of the scientists involved in these programs suddenly were out of work and out of funding. And a lot of them began publishing. They began making these things available that before that had been closed up. One of the scientists in those programs said, he describes applied research he was doing in 1991, and he mentions a coordination of 8 scientific teams and 30 years of research, which culminated in his effort. And this is a picture of Nikolai Kozyrev as a young man. And here's just the mention of the Psychic Discoveries Behind the Iron Curtain book. There's lots and lots of supporting data. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of publications, most of them in Russian. I'm not going to read this to you here, but this is some comments by Russian physicists about particular high-energy physics experiments that appear to correlate with torsion, that are affected by torsion, and that where torsion is able to explain some of the anomalies that otherwise you can't really understand. In other words, it's a real effect. Now, I think there have been internet attacks over the years by a few people who try to say, oh, well, these Russians are just trying to divert you guys on a wild goose chase off into this false area, and don't look over there at that, don't ignore it. And I think that's probably because they kind of wish that it hadn't gotten out of the bag. That's my interpretation anyway. So you can make up your own minds. But I found that there's a lot of physicists who appear to have been involved in these programs. Tomsk University ran a program for more than a decade, doing hundreds of experiments with several dozen Russian scientists that also verified the reality of some of these torsion effects. And it appears to be a fundamental force that really needs to be in Western physics as well. And I'm going to give you kind of a really quickie tutorial. We can talk more about this later. I don't want to bore you if it is boring. But basically, torsion is a different kind of a force. It's a fundamental force that is a twisting of space-time. If you go back and think about Einstein's picture of a gravity as being a curving of space, torsion is a twisting of space, which is something Einstein left out of his original model. It's been developed by Shipov into a very sophisticated mathematical model. He has an entire book. In fact, he has a couple of books and lots of papers which, with equations very well developed that appear to describe the model. One of the top Russian experimentalists, Akimov, has said of Shipov that his equations are the most accurate and consistent with what they found about torsion. One little glimpse into Shipov's model is illustrated in this picture. As you may know today, in our Western physics, the standard belief is that most of what's out there in the universe is dark energy, which actually has a repulsive quality to it. Then we have a smaller amount that's dark matter, which has an attractive quality to it. However, both of these things we don't understand. They don't fit into the Western standard model of particles. Pretty much they were unexpected until observational physicists looked out at the universe and began noticing there are things out there that don't fit our old theory, which is Einstein's relativity. When I was in grad school in the 1970s, I was in the gravity group at Princeton. They were studying things like this, about what's happening with the universe and cosmology, but nobody was really worried much about dark matter or dark energy in those days. So it's kind of come fairly recently in our history of science, and yet you don't find very many physicists saying, oh, we were wrong, we were so stupid. You know, no one's they're all making it sound like, well, of course we know about dark matter, and of course we know about dark energy, as though they kind of expected it, and it fits so well. But it's something we really don't understand. It doesn't fit into our model. However, the interesting thing is that Shipov, the Russian theorist I just mentioned, these are in his model. These are actually predictions of his model, that it should look kind of like this. So his model appears to be an explanation for some of these things that are puzzling Western science. Unfortunately, you don't find Western physicists interested in looking into this stuff. So there's a disconnect there that's kind of hard to understand. Torsion gets created whenever particles flip their spin. Every elementary particle, like electrons, protons, neutrons that have mass, also have a spin. They spin like little tops. If that direction of spin changes, it creates a torsion wave, which they call a phyton. So this is happening all the time. At the small microscopic level, particles are emitting and absorbing these photons. So they're really kind of present in space. They're not something unusual. There are lots of them around. I'm going to skip over some of this, but I think one way of understanding this force is that when a particle, a massive particle, is sitting in space in our Western picture, it's really, there's a lot of dynamics going on, a lot of absorbing of energy and emitting of energy. It's really a very active process. It's only on the average that it's sitting still. It's an equilibrium between inflow and outflow. And when you accelerate the particle or make it move suddenly, you mess up this nice field of energy and you disturb it, knock it out of balance. And that's when these photons are out of balance and they seem to be emitted or absorbed, so that torsion oftentimes shows up when there's a change, when there's a non-equilibrium change. So it's an unusual kind of a force. The Russians find that when they, well, I'll give you an example in a second here. What Kozyrev found is that if you take a cotton swab and dip it into acetone and then let the acetone evaporate, That's what the physicists call a non-equilibrium process. Entropy is increasing as the evaporation is occurring. That actually causes a torsion force. If you put it near a pointer on a stick that can rotate, the stick actually is repelled by the force. It's a pushing force. And what he found that corresponds to what he called right-handed torsion. It's what the Chinese would call one of the polarities of qi. The Russians found that these two polarities, left and right-handed torsion, correspond to the Chinese version of yin and yang qi. What the Russians have found is that particular types of processes, like evaporating acetone, a dying plant, melting of ice, a chemical reaction, or sugar dissolving, all of these produce one polarity of this torsion. Kozyrev said it emits time. It corresponds to what we would call right-handed torsion, which is the pushing form. The Russians found that the other type of process, stretching rubber bands, a healthy growing plant, ice freezing, or a compressed spring, has the opposite effect. Kozyrev said this absorbs time. That produces left-handed torsion. This acts like dark matter. The first type acts like dark energy. So the Russians are really rediscovering in the lab the things our astrophysicists discovered in their telescopes, which is the dark energy and dark matter. But because these are laboratory experiments, they know a lot more about them. They can say a lot more about them and develop real theories of them. When a Qigong master wishes to push something away, he uses the right-handed torsion, the yang qi. When he wants to pull something, he uses the left-handed torsion. A lot of amazing experiments have been done with this energy. And one of the things that has been found is this energy can change the mass of things. It can change how much something weighs. You can make it weigh more or weigh less than it normally would weigh. So if you're a yogi and you want to levitate, then what you want to do is build up the right-handed qi in your body, and that'll make you lighter, cause you to repel gravity, and would actually levitate by this principle. Here's some experiments done by the Russians which show the changing mass of an object when this type of energy is present. One of the remarkable experiments that the Russians have done involves using a telescope, a reflector telescope, a parabolic reflector. You aim it at the sun, and at the focal point of your mirror, you put a special kind of detector that detects torsion. Over the front of the telescope, you put a metal plate. You stop any kind of conventional light or energy from coming in, they still are able to measure the torsion energy from the sun. But they found something unusual. They found the sun appears not just in one place in the sky. Normally, when you look up in the sky, you see the sun in a certain direction. That's where the sun was when the light was emitted. It took 8.3 minutes for it to get from there to here, so you're seeing the sun where it was 8.3 minutes ago. What the Russians found is they got 3 spots. The sun appeared in 3 places. One at that location, 8.3 minutes ago, another one where the sun is instantaneously right now, as though whatever they're measuring is traveling at infinite speed. And they get a 3rd bright spot at where the sun's going to be 8.3 minutes after that. In other words, they're looking at a signal as though it came from the sun backwards in time to here. So they actually get 3 images of the sun, 3 different propagation speeds, one of them backwards in time from there to here. Why that's exciting for people trying to understand psychic processes is this force appears to have the right kinds of properties to understand how you can look into the future, how when you're doing remote viewing, you can send a signal or receive a signal from the future or from the past. There are numerous healing experiments that have been done where the healer will send the healing to be received by someone at another time, not right now, but 2 weeks ago or 2 weeks into the future. This type of time shifting, which is totally unlike the forces we know about in Western physics, but this torsion appears to be able to explain those things. So it may be the key to understanding psychic phenomena and healing phenomena, PK, a lot of the puzzles that we can't explain in Western physics. The Russians have gone a lot further than that over the last several decades. This is a signal generator using torsion, which is pretty handy because you have a signal here that travels faster than light. It travels much faster than light for some situations. And this device can be modulated by signals and then sending a torsion wave through waveguides or through the air. This is just some of the Tomsk University data. It's been applied to metallurgy. It changes how crystals structure, how metals crystallize when they're cooling off. Some people are using devices based on torsion in alternative medicine, energy healing. As a scientist, what's really interesting is this is a glimpse into things at a much smaller scale than Western physics normally thinks about. The Planck scale is called the smallest scale that Western physics is able to say anything meaningful about. It's 20 orders of magnitude smaller. Are we up? Time up? 10 minutes? What is that? 20 minutes. Oh, do I have to? Okay, the rest will be in sign language. Okay, so there's 20 orders of magnitude. That is 10 with 20 zeros after it. If you start from the size of an atom and go smaller and smaller and smaller, 10 to the 20th times smaller is where the Planck scale is. There's a huge amount of real estate in there, very, very small things that our Western science doesn't know anything about, and that's where unified field theory, or string theory to start with, but unified field theory, hopefully can go to be able to explain what happens at these smaller and smaller scales. Well, that appears to be the regime where torsion is really important. So it may be that this force that the Russians have discovered really can tell us a lot about what goes on at those small scales. The Western picture is that if you had a very powerful microscope and you could look down in very small dimensions and looked at an electron, what it might be appearing to be sitting still, but really it's zigzagging around. It's being bombarded by energy from all sides, and it's zigging and zagging and going back and forth. And it looks kind of like this picture. And this is called the Zitterbewegung, or the random walk that electrons go through. And it appears as though maybe its torsion plays a role. It's not just photons, but maybe torsion is causing some of this wiggling that it goes through. If that's true, then it gives us some clues on how to build torsion into a better model of physics. I'm going to try to skip through some of this stuff here. In my first book, the last chapter, I talk about the beginnings of a theory of how we could explain the paranormal phenomena like remote viewing and out-of-body and teleportation and things like that with a theory that's not Western science, but it's an extension built on Western science and taking it a little further so we can include the effects of consciousness and the effects of the paranormal. So my first book has a chapter like that. The second book, I go quite a bit further and include the life force in there as well and show how that can also be explained. But it's important, first of all, to just make a little comment that Einstein said that if we knew what we were doing, it wouldn't be called research, would it? So we're doing our best here with some ideas and intuition to sketch out what might be a viable way to build a science. It's not a finished theory. It's certainly not a proven theory. These are some ideas on how we might be able to proceed. If they're right, then maybe there might be some ways we can use some of these ideas in experiments or in inventions as well. Einstein was very fond of using imagination and intuition in his research. Here's a thought experiment he did, sitting on a beam of light, which he imagined, and he came up with special relativity from this thought experiment by imagining how the world around him would look traveling at a very, very high rate of speed. If you take a picture like that, the electron can be thought of as something zigging and zagging around in a random walk in both space and time. One of the discoveries of modern physics is that particles travel backwards in time some of the time, and then forward in time some of the time. On the average, they're going forward in time, but they're really going both directions. This is sort of Feynman's picture of how things behave at very small scales. This is a sketch of some of the present models describing particle behavior at these small scales. One of the approaches I like has been developed by Bernard Hayes, Hal Puthoff, and some other scientists, where they try to take our current Western science and kind of look under the hood. In our current Western picture, a lot of things are concealed. We have a quantum physics rules, but nobody tries to explain why it should be the way it is. These scientists, I think, are much more interested in consciousness, and they realize if we're ever going to be able to understand consciousness, we have to look under the hood and look more detailed at why it is things behave the way they do. And there's a dynamics that's present. So that model is called statistical electrodynamics, or SED, and it's a little bit more detailed in terms of why things behave the way they do. And I like that approach, and I think all they have to do is add torsion to it. You'll have probably a much better model. But in either case, you're trying to explain the fabric of space-time. As I said before, Einstein talked about space as being able to curve, and this curvature gives rise to forces. If you think about that fabric as being made of fibers like a cloth, and those fibers are actually the torsion particles, the photons, then that's a pretty good picture, I think, that incorporates the Russian torsion work as well. I'm sorry, I'm running out of water. Getting very dry here. So this model also assumes that anything local is also interacting with things far away. They're exchanging these photons, these torsion particles, over very large distances. So things that happen far away still are important to things that are happening close by. I explain in the book why this actually makes some sense. I won't go into that much here. The only important, it tries to picture everything at a deeper level, at a more detailed level than current Western science does. One of the keys to torsion is because it has this component that travels backwards in time, as well as one that goes forwards in time, it makes something possible that Richard Feynman and John Wheeler speculated about in 1945 in a well-known paper. They were both trying to go back to this idea of Mach's principle, how things that are far away could be important to what's happening locally. And normally the problem is, if something's far away, it takes a very long time for any signal to get there, and then a long time for any signal to get back here. So how can anything very far away have any influence on things that are nearby? John Wheeler and Richard Feynman said, well, suppose the photon can travel backwards in time as well as forwards in time. Then if you have an electron that's wiggling here, it sends off a photon that goes off into space and travels, billions of light years until it hits the distant matter, the stars that are far away, and it makes them wiggle. But if it makes a wave that also goes backwards in time, then that wiggling electron way out there could send a signal backwards in time. If it's coming backwards in time, then it comes this way. It takes 10 billion negative years, which means it gets here just about the same time the first one went out. So the round trip takes almost no time at all if you can go backwards in time as well as forwards. That was what they proposed in 1945. And that's, although no one really has any evidence that photons do that, we do know that the photons do that, these torsion waves. So it looks like torsion is the perfect force to make this connection, to connect us to distant matter, and to show why there's this interaction going on that, and why distant things can affect us, even right when they're happening, right now. So that's the interesting and kind of exciting idea, and that leads to this idea of a synchronized universe. If you have a particle that's moving in a certain way and it's zipping around, there's a reason, and that's described in the book. The particle basically, because it's moving so fast, it travels at the speed of light, it only sees things that are straight ahead. It has tunnel vision. This is a relativistic effect. It only sees things that it happens to be traveling toward at that moment. So it can interact with a particle that's straight ahead at that moment. And likewise, the one out there only can interact with this one if it's aiming right at this one at that moment. So two particles, when they're lined up, can interact. Other particles they won't see. So if you have particles that are orbiting together, that are synchronized, then it's possible to synchronize and line up these effects so particles interact with other particles, even over great distances, as long as they're moving in a synchronous way. Thank you. So it leads to the idea that you can have a system of these particles that are all moving synchronously together. They'll see each other. They'll say, you're real, I'm real, we're matter, we're real stuff, you know, because we feel forces on each other. You can have other particles traveling in a different phase, a different frequency. You won't see them. They'll be there, but because they're out of phase and they're not aimed the right direction at the right time, you won't feel the effects. They'll be invisible to you. So it's a little bit like the fan that's turning. You have a strobe light flashing on it. If the strobe frequency matches the turning of the fan, the blades will appear to be solid, and they'll appear to be, to stop, basically. But if the flashing frequency of the strobe does not match the fan, the blades disappear. They're not synchronized. So that's kind of the idea of this model. And it leads to the prediction that our reality is really the particles that are synchronized with us. You could have other synchronized planes of reality that are present right here in this room, but they're synchronized differently. You won't see them. You'll feel random effects from them, but you won't feel anything that's a real force. So it's possible by this to have many parallel universes. And you're only really conscious of and detecting one, but they're all present. If you shift your phase or shift your frequency, then you'll be able to see one of the other ones. And when I proposed this in the first book, I thought, well, this is a natural prediction, and it helps explain some things, like how people pass through walls, things like that. But I never really expected that I would get any evidence that it was actually real. Since then, I've been amazed at the number of examples that have come up where these types of things actually seem to happen. So that's a whole other discussion. Where this might be important is in terms of consciousness, because we process things in our mind in terms of deciding something's real is limited by certain processing frequencies in the brain, such as the gamma frequency of about 40 hertz or so, where we decide, okay, we put things together and we conclude something's real. So there's a kind of a bandwidth in terms of how our brain processes the data to make decisions about what's real, what's external reality. And 40 hertz kind of comes up as one of those key numbers. So it makes you wonder, because in this set of sheets of layers of parallel realities, there's a frequency difference between layers, and it kind of makes me wonder, well, maybe that frequency difference has something to do with 40 hertz. That's a wild speculation at this point, but the reality that we are aware of is the reality that we are synchronized with. Our consciousness is synchronized with these particles that we say are real. So there's a synchronization that the mind is actually tied in with our perception of reality. So it might turn out to be something important. In this model, if you're in a different layer, a different sheet in a stack of sheets of realities, it would be just, you would not be aware of the presence of that other layer. In fact, one possibility is that what we call quantum noise, what we call the uncertainty principle, that extra noise that makes it hard to predict things in quantum physics, that might be the effect of the other parallel realities that are all present. They're all out of phase with each other. To us, in our own synchronized reality, it looks like noise. So it's a possibility. There's more to this model. One of the keys is that it's the distant matter, the pattern of motion, the pattern of ripples and disturbances on the distant matter that plays an important part in anything that we would call a solid particle. At this point, I'm probably just going to skip ahead, I think, here. But it's in the book, if you're interested. Our mind plays a very important role in how we perceive reality and how we can affect reality. Because our mind is a coherent process. Our mind involves DNA and other chemicals that are interacting with each other, and they act like oscillators. They're able to couple in with external particles and perceive reality in a certain way. So that I'm going to have to skip part of this here. In terms of understanding higher dimensions, I talk about how you would make matter that corresponds to higher dimensions. There are a number of predictions of this model. It can explain some of the things that are otherwise puzzling, how manifesting works, why biorhythms end up being correlated between the sender and the receiver when healers are working. This is a little picture that kind of shows the idea both for remote viewing as well as for ESP, as well as psychokinesis. Basically you have an observer and you have a target on the other side, and you're sending waves both into the future and into the past. Distant matter is reflecting them and then refocusing them. And in this way, you can make contact with things at great distance without losing energy. One of the puzzles, if it's any kind of conventional form of energy like electromagnetism, trying to affect somebody 1,000 miles away, the energy is dissipated. You have very little energy that actually can get from here to a distant person. But with a four-dimensional focusing, as I describe here, it actually makes sense to do that. This model can explain why it is, how it is, that a healer can reach his hand into a person, as some Philippine healers do. It explains why the brainwave frequencies correspond to the auric layers of the body. It explains, it offers a model for the Akashic record. These torsion waves actually can explain how memory and events can be stored in the distant matter of the universe and how we can actually access it and recover it. And it's a model for origin of consciousness. So I think I'm going to pull it together and close up at this point. As you might imagine, when a person becomes more adept at affecting distant matter and these vibrations and these parallel realities, it's possible to cause bigger and bigger distortions. Normally, someone who is not trained very well, not very disciplined, can cause small effects. Adepts and people who have strong abilities can cause very large effects. And I talk about that in the model as well. So there's kind of a hierarchy from the novice to the adept in terms of the ability to cause changes in external reality. So I'll just conclude by saying Bob Monroe was right. We're more than our physical bodies. And as Victor Hugo said, all of the armies of the world are not as powerful as an idea whose time has come. So thank you very much.